June 14th, 2013 was a date that marked a complete change to the gaming industry. It's also a date that changed my life forever. Famous PlayStation developer Naughty Dog was set to release a new game in a new series, a game called The Last of Us, a tale of two survivors traversing the dangers of a post-apocalyptic America, doing whatever it takes to survive both the outside world as well as dealing with their own inner struggles. And after the wild success of the Uncharted trilogy, this was actually a pretty big risk for Naughty Dog. The bombastic, action-packed gameplay with quippy one-liners was traded for a slower, more grounded realism and a much darker story. This gamble worked though, as The Last of Us took the world by storm, getting high reviews, awards, audience praise, and even piercing the gamer bubble to be something that even the normies have heard about. It was so good, in fact, that many games that we have seen in the years that followed have tried to emulate that success, that formula with third-person narrative action, grounded in realism, and perhaps the occasional sad dad for a little extra panache. This game changed everything for gamers and the gaming industry, and it certainly changed everything for me. But what changed everything for me was not the story of the game. The single player campaign was great, don't get me wrong, but the most consequential part of this game for me was this little, almost hidden menu option tucked away. A mode simply called Factions. A multiplayer which sought to take the world and the gameplay from the story and allow players to face off against each other in a PvP setting. It was definitely tacked on, and it was pretty bare bones. And I mean, there weren't even infected in this mode, but yet, there was something so special about this game. The cat and the mouse dynamics, the tension, the slower pace, the satisfying gunplay, all of this bucked the common trends of multiplayer games at the time and offered something fresh and unique, something that is actually still missing in gaming today. I obsessed over this game. I analyzed everything. I spent hours poring over the subreddit, looking for strategies and secrets. This game is the reason that this channel even exists. It's an amazing game, and it has an amazing following. But the journey and the story of this multiplayer mode is not an easy one. It is one that is fraught with peril, much like the story and the world that Naughty Dog have developed with The Last of Us. Dr. Pooplove here, and today I want to tell the full story of The Last of Us Factions. In this video, I will talk about the inception of Factions, its rise and fall, and how things have gotten to such a dark place for this game. I will also touch on the potential of a future here, but ultimately I want to celebrate this game for what it is by reliving the moments of its history. This video compiles content from a trio of videos from my History of The Last of Us series, but in typical Naughty Dog-like fashion, this content has been remastered from the ground up with more content and context, and of course, major updates to the story have happened since that had been posted. And because I've recently started compiling this ultimate video game tier list for my retrospective reviews, I will also decide once and for all where Factions belongs on this. Now, before we get into it, I want to give a shout out to members of the community who helped source some of the information I compiled for this video: Punish Coyote, Look, Gumma Flores, and Lurian. I also want to thank my YouTube members for sticking with me and offering support. But without further ado, let's get right into it. Now, where exactly do you start when you want to talk about this beautiful multiplayer? Of course, in some ways, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go to its inception and its creation. But I think one of the best ways to actually set this conversation up actually isn't really even at the start or even before Factions came out. I actually want to talk about this multiplayer recruitment video, which came out after Factions was already released. And in this video, Neil Druckmann is featured, and he talks about Naughty Dog's multiplayer design philosophy. And he says that whenever Naughty Dog tries to come up with a multiplayer for one of their games, they try to think of it as more than a mode and rather an experience or a feeling. And I think this is something that we should really keep in mind as we get into the creation of Factions, because I think a lot of its success comes down to exactly this. Factions in many ways is a feeling. And I think one of the things that makes it so powerful is how it creates those feelings within us. Now, let's dive deeper. And I think it would be wrong to discuss the history of factions without first giving a nod to Naughty Dog's other multiplayer games, because these basically laid the foundations for what factions ultimately would become. Naughty Dog's first multiplayer technically was Crash Team Racing. And actually, you might want to go back even further. I believe Way of the Warrior was a multiplayer. But for purposes of the more modern PlayStation Naughty Dog, Crash Team Racing is that first multiplayer. And it wasn't online, but you could play split screen co-op against your friends. And what this did was it proved that Naughty Dog could make a PvP entry even when they've been known for their single player experiences. It's important to recognize that Naughty Dog has always had an innovative streak to them and an attention to quality, because even when a game might be a little bit out of their wheelhouse, there is intention and ambition poured in, and nothing they ever produce is ever half-assed. And as we will ultimately discover, this may be part of their downfall when it comes to their multiplayer ambitions in the present, but we will get to that. What's interesting though about Crash Team Racing is that it doesn't follow the same mechanics that you see in the normal Crash games. In Crash, you're jumping up and down, you're spinning, you're controlling Crash himself, but in Team Racing, you're essentially controlling a kart. It was essentially copying Mario Kart, but the mechanics are completely different from anything you see in Crash. Unless you want to count some of the riding levels, maybe even the motorcycle level, but even those aren't the same mechanics. They're not really that close. And so Crash Team Racing could kind of be considered separately from the single player. Now moving on, we also have another multiplayer entry from Naughty Dog, and that of course is Jak X Combat Racing. We shouldn't forget about that because it was a quality multiplayer entry that accompanied a very wonderful single player Jak series. What's notable here that although again it wasn't using the main mechanics from Jak, in Jak you're running around, you have guns, you're spinning and jumping and platforming, but in Jak there are a lot of driving mechanics, and in this case they did much more closely mirror those exact driving mechanics from Jak 3 into Jak X Combat Racing. So this was kind of the first real attempt from Naughty Dog to at least utilize mechanics from their single player games into a multiplayer entry. But of course the real prelude for The Last of Us Factions actually came in September of 2009, and that's when players got their hands on a demo for a brand new experience from Naughty Dog. This demo was released for an online third-person multiplayer shooter that was set for a full release alongside the sequel to Naughty Dog's relatively new Uncharted franchise, Uncharted 2: Among Thieves. Now, Uncharted 1 did not include a multiplayer, but with Uncharted 2, Naughty Dog had designed a multiplayer largely built around the mechanics of that game. And so this demo was actually a multiplayer beta, which gave players access for the first time to be able to test this new online multiplayer. Eventually, though, it would also be fully released with the actual game release of Uncharted 2. And now, I can't claim to be an expert on any of the history of Uncharted 2 multiplayer. I have played the mode, but I don't have a ton of experience. And of course, it's not available to play anymore. There are some pretty cool videos out there that discuss more about the patches and the history and the community for that game, but it's still significant for talking about factions because, well, this is the first time that Naughty Dog had put their multiplayer game online, and this pitted players around the world against each other. And this time it was created largely around the same mechanics from the single player. The main mechanics though, this time, the running around, the shooting, the climbing, all of that had made its way into this multiplayer entry. And so it was a real good way for people who enjoyed the gameplay of the single player to continue to play, but now versus real people. As a first outing, Uncharted 2 multiplayer was seemingly amazing, as many Uncharted multiplayer fans considered that to be the best Uncharted multiplayer of all time. It was a fairly simple PvP arena multiplayer. It didn't have sprinting, and it didn't really have a whole lot of loadout customization. But this was also the norm for the PS3 era. Typically, when a single player came out, there was a multiplayer experience released alongside, again, for that replayability factor, and perhaps to monetize the product further with DLC. The strategy also remained for the third Uncharted entry, which brings me to the direct prelude to factions, Uncharted 3 multiplayer. Now with Uncharted 3, it appears that Naughty Dog thought their multiplayer actually had some promise as they ended up increasing support. There was a lot more DLC drops and longer support life for Uncharted 3 multiplayer. And although some preferred the Uncharted 2 multiplayer, Uncharted 3 multiplayer was popular enough, at least among the tacked on multiplayers that were coming out for single player games. It definitely had its own cult following, at least. Again though, my exposure to this entry was minimal. I played it, and I actually did play it before Factions, but not a ton of it, and I certainly never got good. It's hard for me to say whether they considered this entry successful or not, but it must have been enough because they did continue with the strategy of attaching a multiplayer to their next game as well. And I am certainly glad they did, because that is how we get Factions. Now, there's not a ton of stuff out there about the making of The Last of Us Factions. Even though there are plenty of documentaries out there about the making of The Last of Us, they don't really talk too much about the making of the multiplayer. But there has been a good amount of information that we can largely get from level designer David Ballard, former Naughty Dog employee who has done several interviews over the years discussing where Naughty Dog's heads were at when they were deciding to make this multiplayer. And initially, it turns out that Factions was largely designed to be a cooperative experience with two main modes: hostage rescue and cart push. Now, according to David Ballard in an article for the website 80LV, where he also goes over some of the design philosophy for Factions, this is how he describes these two modes. Hostage rescue entailed players starting at one base on the map and fighting their way towards the second base, where an NPC hostage was being held. Now, you can think about this. The bases are especially noticeable in the earlier maps. You have these larger buildings that you can go in with corridors and closets, and not a lot of action actually ends up happening here. But all this design was there, and so these were actually more important for these old modes. They actually had a little bit more use, and they're not just somewhere where you can go camp. The other mode that was designed was called cart push, and he says that cart push required the players to push a supply cart from one base to the other while also fighting off enemy NPCs. And this actually kind of reminds me of Plunder in Uncharted, where you're trying to transport one object from one side of the map to the other, except in this case doing it with a cart, which is kind of interesting. I guess they would have incorporated the cart pushing mechanics from The Last of Us Part 1. Like when you're trying to get these dumpsters and other objects on wheels, they probably would have used those same mechanics. And you'd have to push it from one end of the base to the other while fighting off NPCs, in this case as opposed to other players. Now, David also explains that the co-op ultimately was cut from the game. There was limited time and resources dedicated to this multiplayer, and so a lot of the level designs, at least for the initial maps, had to be kind of redesigned in order to accommodate a competitive PvP gameplay. Now, it's actually funny because there was a glitch, and I don't know if you can still do it. It might only be available on the PS3 version, but you could actually get into a very broken co-op mode. There are some videos of it floating around on YouTube, but you could get into a very glitchy, buggy co-op mode where it seemed like there's actually some NPCs in there, but they didn't really interact very well, and obviously the co-op wasn't complete, but it does kind of prove that yes, they were very much trying to do a co-op. What's also interesting is there was this Reddit AMA with Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley where they were being asked about The Last of Us. And there were a number of questions regarding the multiplayer as well, with many people asking for an infected horde mode. And apparently they had considered it, but eventually they just decided it was too time and resource intensive in order to pull that off. But definitely something that was in consideration in the early stages of designing this multiplayer. It's actually very interesting because I think these modes would be pretty sweet, although maybe cart pushing would kind of get annoying. But I remember that after Factions released, many people were asking about co-op experiences and infected in the game. It was one of the most requested things. It seems that they never really had plans to actually revisit this development work, but we've also found that the initial plans for the maps were actually meant to be much bigger. In a series of interviews with PlayStation expert Colin Moriarty for IGN, again talking to David Ballard, David went into depth on what some of those design plans were. Original maps had, as I said before, these bases where you would defend, but the scale of the maps was also so much bigger. Dam, for instance, was initially the biggest map in the game. And if you go there, you can see there's like a bridge and there's even trails kind of off in the distance. And those were actually supposed to be part of the initial map. Other things like Lakeside used to be able to climb up on top of buildings, and even the clock tower in Billstown had a sniper perch that you were able to get up to and snipe down below. There actually used to be a glitch in the game where you could prove all this out. There was a way to catapult people with a nail board, and it launched them up in the sky and far distances away. And using this glitch, you could actually get people to far away out of bounds parts of the map, like say the clock tower. And basically this showed that, yeah, these maps did used to be a lot bigger because some of these areas were pretty fleshed out. Now, all of this is really interesting because it offers a glimpse at what factions could have been, especially had these features not been scaled down and reprioritized in order to get this game out to market with a functional multiplayer. And it's interesting to me when you think about that, perhaps this unrealized ambition maybe has been pent up in a lot of these level designers and multiplayer designers, such that it did end up inspiring Naughty Dog to try to create that standalone multiplayer game, which we've heard was called The Last of Us Online, which from what we've learned about it, at least in concept, did appeal to be at a much larger scale. Of course, we'll talk about that later. But after going through some of these initial stages of development, Factions was then refocused to being a PvP only experience. And this is where we can turn to none other than Quentin Cobb, aka Q Train, for Naughty Dog's design philosophy. Now, if you don't know who Q Train is, he was a developer at Naughty Dog who was often very public facing. So he would often interact with the community, and it's actually kind of sad. He kind of got chased out of this community from a lot of toxicity that was going on, but he was a pretty central figure in Naughty Dog multiplayer devs' communication to the community. Now, as such, he doesn't work at Naughty Dog anymore, but he definitely played a very pivotal role in the development of Factions. And Quentin described Naughty Dog's design philosophy for Factions in a PlayStation blog post where he says, and I quote, "The inspiration really came from the combat encounters of the single-player campaign. We wanted to mirror the slow pace and high lethality of those encounters while keeping a very similar crafting and scavenging system. We did this by making every weapon very lethal, placing crafting items inside of item caches located in strategic parts of the map, having the player appear on radar while sprinting, and keeping ammo very scarce. This would lead to players sneaking around the map, trying to get to item caches and picking the moment to attack very carefully and making their shots count. We also had a down state, which would allow players to revive teammates. All these factors put an emphasis on stealth and teamwork, which many shooters don't achieve. This created a very unique experience, which we feel makes our multiplayer special." I definitely agree with that, especially that last piece, because this multiplayer does feel very unique. There's a scarcity in the amount of things you can have. It makes everything feel so much more impactful. When you use that Molotov, you know that you might not be able to get one for a long time. You know that when you have 2 bullets left in your gun, that your chances of getting out alive are very slim. But especially when you can pull that off and you can get out of a very dicey situation and come out on top, it makes this game so addicting. It makes it so worth it. Now, we can also get a little bit more about the inspiration for this multiplayer with a quote by lead multiplayer designer and crossbow enthusiast Aaron Daly, who expanded to say that, in general, players playing overly aggressive will usually find themselves at a disadvantage in The Last of Us. In the end, it's a game where your tactical decision-making matters more than your aiming reflexes. And I will agree to some extent on that, because players have definitely learned how to play more aggressively. He also says that we also need to add some of our own unique elements to multiplayer that didn't exist in the single player. For this, we built a new loadout system with a variety of survival skills, added some new guns, and added an in-game store where players can use parts they earn in combat to purchase additional ammo, weapon upgrades, and armor. Combined with the crafting system, it offers a lot of on-the-fly tactical choices. And then he also expanded on the revive system. Another big addition was the revive system, when the players take enough damage to go into a down state and can crawl around slowly while bleeding out. With only 4 players on each team, it means that every life matters, and sticking with your team and keeping them alive is a very big part of the game. It also adds a lot of consequences to death, something we wanted to capture from single player. Taking out one enemy is a big deal, as is losing one of your own team. And so something they really wanted to be a part of this game was this teamwork and being able to think on the fly and try to make tactical choices. And I do think that they were successful in that. I think that is part of what has ultimately created a very cult following for this game. You can't really get an experience quite like this anywhere else. And this makes me think back to Neil Druckmann's words about their overall multiplayer design philosophy, about it being more of an experience and a feeling. What's clear here is that Naughty Dog was developing something quite a bit different from the norm, something to serve more as a companion to the single player. You weren't playing as Joel and Ellie. Instead, you had a bit of your own story. It was simple, but you were playing as a random member of a faction that was at odds with another faction. The final product, of course, resembles the factions that we know today, with simple menus and a 12-week journey. But at initial release, of course, there were less modes and maps and guns and perks, and those would be added later. And when you look back at it all, it does kind of feel a bit like this game came together at the last minute. It was special, there was intention, but there were some things that didn't quite feel like they had the chance to get fully fleshed out. Now, I could not source information from a direct source to back up that this multiplayer was probably kind of rushed out the door. In fact, I actually have a source that rebuts that notion. Arnie Meyer, who is still at Naughty Dog, stated that the multiplayer was not a rushed afterthought or a tacked on mode in the comments section of the PlayStation blog. Regardless of that though, it does seem that they never really got a chance to fully realize the initial vision for this game. And I'm sure time and budget constraints are mostly the reason why. Because of course, these devs were very passionate about the work that they were doing. And they do have that Naughty Dog ambition that gets poured into every game that they put out. But what this multiplayer team did ultimately put together was great. And it won over the hearts of many. And it turned out to surprise not only gamers, but Naughty Dog themselves as to how well it was received. According to, again, Colin Moriarty in an episode of his PlayStation podcast, Sacred Symbols, Naughty Dog was totally shocked that people enjoyed the multiplayer. It seemed that despite having to pare a lot of things down, what they actually ended up with was a great core experience that would ultimately hook many and create a cult following. And this proves in many ways that Naughty Dog at least was simply the best. Now, even on a lower budget with less time, the pure talent and intention that the studio has been able to cultivate is enough to create great and memorable experiences, even ones that are not considered to be their bread and butter. But what was Factions like in those initial days on the PS3 after it finally launched? And what initial updates were in store that would shape this game into the one that we know and love today? I'll never forget the week of The Last of Us launch on PS3 because I was seriously debating whether I even wanted to get that game. I wasn't really interested much in zombie type horror games. It wasn't really my cup of tea, but I was a huge Naughty Dog fan. I had loved all of their games up until this point. And so ultimately, when I did make that decision, I decided to go ahead and get it. And I would say not even an hour into playing the game did I decide to check out Factions. And immediately it really kind of caught my attention. And I have a lot of fondness for those early days of Factions because I didn't have a single clue what I was doing, but also neither did anyone else. It was interesting because with this game, everyone kind of started off at zero. It was a pretty new kind of style of multiplayer. There wasn't really a whole lot that were out that were like it. You could be really great at Call of Duty, but that really was only going to get you so far. You pretty much had to change your mindset and be a lot more tactical when playing this game. You had to be more focused on scarcity, survival, and tactics rather than twitch shooting. Of course, fast reaction times ultimately became something that you could use to your advantage in this game, but that was really only something that came about after players started slowly discovering some new techniques that they could use to allow that playstyle to be feasible. And boy, did I sucked at this game. I really had no clue what I was doing. I remember one of my first matches ever was on the dam, and I was playing Survivors, and I opened the supply box, and out came all these supplies. And I thought to myself, I'll just grab like one or two of these because I want the rest of my teammates to be able to have some supplies as well. I don't want to take everything from them, especially, I'm a newer player. I'm probably not going to do very well with these things. It wasn't until maybe a few games later that I finally realized that actually the supplies that came out were unique to me. But I just became infatuated with this game, and I would play the single player for about an hour at a time, and then I would hop onto the multiplayer and just, try my best. I ultimately kind of got myself to a process where I had Brawler on and a Shiv and a Smoke, and I would kind of be able to guarantee myself certain downs. I would just, make sure I got 2 nailboard downs with the Brawler perk on. I made sure to get Smokes and Shivs to get a couple downs, and that basically was how I got my start because I had no idea how to aim. It's funny thinking back to those early days because things were just so different back then. First of all, the semi-auto was considered to be the most OP gun in the game. Some people even argued in the early days that the bow was, because anyone that had kind of figured out how to use it was just destroying people, and no one really knew where the arrows were coming from. They didn't have as much situational awareness back then. So it was funny how many times you would see a post on Reddit or the forums that the bow was OP. But the semi-auto was... Most people agreed that the semi-auto was OP at the time. And what's really funny is that the burst was considered a very weak gun. Now, back in the PS3 days, this game was only playing at 30 frames per second. And in the really early days, you only had 2 modes. You had Survivors and Supply Raid. And you only had 2 playlists. You didn't even have parties or no parties. Another interesting thing was that the hunting rifle scope, whenever you got a headshot, you didn't actually get a full bloom 8 damage marker indicator. The scope of the rifle would block basically the vertical and horizontal lines of your damage marker. So you would only get the X, which also is what shows for body shots. So you could never really confirm that you got a headshot until you saw that you got extra parts from it. What's also interesting is that there was no DLC perks or weapons or DLC maps. You can tell that when the DLC maps did start coming in, you can tell the difference between them and the OG maps based on the bases. The bases were part of the old design of the original factions that kind of stopped serving much of a purpose. That was kind of something that just kind of stayed in those maps that ultimately they didn't need to design for anymore. And so that's a little bit about how the game was and how it felt like in those early days. But I think the best way to kind of summarize how factions evolved and how it continued to emerge into what we know and love today is to go through the major patch changes. Not only were these patches a response to the way the game was being played, but they also marked a new chapter. Sometimes they even marked a new meta as to how the game would ultimately be played. And so I think the first significant patch that we can talk about is patch 1.02, released on the 28th of June in 2013. And what this did was this established a no party playlist. A lot of players were complaining because they were playing by themselves and they were running into full teams and they were just getting slaughtered. And there wasn't really any way for someone who didn't have a full team with them to really enjoy this game. I remember being just completely trounced. One thing that maybe Naughty Dog didn't initially realize was how strong teamwork actually could be. So this patch established a no party playlist so that players, especially like myself at the time, who didn't have a teammate, didn't even have friends on PSN at the time, could queue up and play a little bit more even playing field. I think there's always been some matchmaking issues with this game, but this was definitely something that was needed in a very good addition. Now, the next major patch of consequence to come out was patch 1.03 that came out on August 28th, 2013. And this added interrogation. In the patch notes, it describes interrogation as a 4 versus 4 2-part objective game mode where rival factions vie to find and open the other faction's lockbox, stealing the supplies inside. Each team must first achieve 5 interrogations of players on the other team. Players can get interrogations by shivving an enemy or getting an enemy into a down state, then pressing triangle while next to them. Once your team collects 5 interrogations, the location of the enemy's lockbox will be revealed. Your team must attempt to open the lockbox before the other team can collect 5 interrogations and open your lockbox first. Whichever team opens the opposing team lockbox first wins. And this mode is actually awesome, and I think it's still kind of underrated. I don't play it enough, even though I do think it's very unique and very fun. And one thing I love about interrogation is it actually made the bases in the original map a little bit more important, because a lot of times the lockbox would spawn inside those bases, and so it was like you had a fortified zone that you could defend, and it became very fun, especially on the offense, trying to kind of find a way to take over the enemy's base. And up to this point, factions only had 2 game modes: Supply Raid, which was kind of more of a team deathmatch type mode, and Survivors, which I think in the earlier days was much more popular, especially when most people were playing a lot more slowly, and the intensity in that mode was great. But of course, it became a heavy camp fest as people realized that, as without really an objective, teams could find that they could just kind of be campy and wait the other team out. And as long as they just killed one or had more people on their team, they would win. So interrogation was a nice addition because it did include an objective, and there also wasn't a life limit. So it became a good way, I think, for people to kind of practice and get a little bit better. There was kind of a lot of people, though, that wouldn't really be playing this mode for the objective. They didn't really care to open the box. It was more about farming kills and, trying to see how many downs you could get in a single game. So at least initially, this mode came out and was kind of incentivized to support, yes, a lot of farming. It's a little bit better now, but it's still something that happens. But shortly after interrogations launched, there was also some hot fixes that came out with some balance changes, and these are pretty notable in how they changed some of the guns. A live update came out on September 5th, 2013, with the hunting rifle, the unupgraded version getting a 10% increase in scope and speed, an 8% increase in reload speed, and for upgrade 1, an 8% increase in scope and speed. And this increase in scope and speed, I think, did kind of encourage players to be a little bit more quick scoping with their hunting rifle. In the early days, I don't think a whole lot of people knew or were practicing this, but there was one such person who I will be talking about here shortly, who I consider kind of the godfather of how we use the hunting rifle today. This update also, though, gave a change to the flamethrower, and it increased the killing efficiency of that weapon. Now, I'm not sure if this was the trigger point, but the flamethrower started off really weak, and then there was a period of time when it was basically OP. I remember running into matches where if a player had a flamethrower on, you basically couldn't escape. It's funny when you think about the flamethrower today and how less effective it is, but this could have been the change that made the flamethrower super OP. Now, what's funny is there isn't really a patch that shows them making any change again to the flamethrower, but they definitely did somewhere. I think someone was hypothesizing that it could have been a netcode fix or some fixes with the lag that made it so the flamethrower just inherently wasn't as powerful. But I just remember you got caught in some flame and you were gone. Now, another live update on September 17th of 2013 added a couple other things which are notable. So the semi-auto rifle actually got a nerf. Its clip size was reduced from 10 to 8 on the unupgraded version, and its accuracy was reduced by 8%. For the level 1 upgrade, the clip size was reduced from 12 to 11, and the accuracy was reduced by 4%. So a lot of the people who had been complaining about the semi-auto rifle and how good it was finally got their nerf. But what's funny is I don't think the hate for the semi-auto rifle was really over at this point. A lot of times, a lot of people would call you a noob or call you out for just using the semi-auto. It's kind of funny because from this point, I don't think there's many changes to the semi-auto rifle. From this point on, it's basically the same gun. I think what happened is people just slowly started discovering how powerful the other guns could be, and the semi-auto kind of just fell back to being an all-around good gun, but not OP. The Shorty received an upgrade in this with a rate of fire increased by 10%, and on the unupgraded version and an upgrade level 1 rate of fire increased by 7%. So clearly, I don't really know that people were saying the Shorty was too weak, but clearly they decided to buff it. And what's also funny is the burst rifle got a buff. The ammo cost was reduced from 150 to 120. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but I don't think this change was really needed at all. And considering how easy it is to get enough bullets for your burst, especially compared to other guns, this definitely wasn't something that I think made a whole lot of sense. But the next patch to come was actually pretty major. This was the introduction of the first DLC map pack called Abandoned Territories. And this was in patch 1.05 and came on October 15th, 2013. And this was a paid DLC. So if you are like me and you bought the season pass, this was included in it, or you could buy this map pack individually. But this included bookstore, suburbs, bus depot, and hometown. And although for me, I still kind of like the original maps better, this first map pack does have some really, really good entries. I especially love bookstore, and I think hometown is pretty underrated. I know it's a night map, but it's still pretty underrated in my opinion. And what this did was this actually created a brand new playlist. It was called the DLC playlist, and it was added for each of the game modes. And this is kind of where you start to see a little bit of unraveling in factions, in that now each game mode had 3 separate player pools: parties, no parties, and DLC 1. And so this kind of ended up becoming a problem over time, in that not every one of those pools was always very populated. It would get even worse later when you get the next DLC map pack, but this is kind of one of those things, I think, lessons that Naughty Dog had to learn, in that having these DLC playlists was actually kind of hurting and splitting the player base. This patch also added a few gameplay tweaks. For instance, the 2x4 spawning logic had been adjusted in supply raid and interrogation. I remember at this time there was kind of a way that you could almost guarantee yourself a 2x4. It would always spawn in the middle boxes. So a lot of times people would just run straight to the middle boxes so that they could get a 2x4 and then run back, and then usually they would have enough to be able to craft a modded melee weapon. There also was a glitch that was going on for quite a bit of time, and this was something that was in the single player, where if you actually had 2 modded melee weapons right next to each other and you just swapped back and forth between them, it would populate within your inventory crafting supplies in order to make infinite shivs. And so what a lot of times people would do, before Naughty Dog eventually patched this out, people would run to the spawn box where a 2x4 would pop out, but they wouldn't pick it up. Then they would go to another supply box where a 2x4 would still spawn. So you would have essentially 2 2x4s on the same map, and all you would have to do is pick up one, bring it to the other, and do this swap out with 2 modded melee weapons to just get infinite supplies. And it was really a pretty broken glitch that people were exploiting to essentially guarantee themselves infinite shivs and infinite modded melee weapons. This patch also made another change to melee, in that it switched brawler level 1 and 2, so that the health backed from getting melee hits was actually at level 1 now, and the double modded melee weapons was moved to level 2. And this patch also included a little bit of interrogation mode fixes, where the game no longer would end in a tie if both teams were unable to fully unlock their lockbox. Instead, it was whoever had the most sections of their lockbox completed by the time the match ended would be the winner. And there's something very interesting that was added to this patch as well. And I'll quote from the patch notes: "We now have the capability to ban players who are found to be exploiting and or cheating the game or other players. To enact bans, we need concrete proof that an illicit action has taken place. And that is where you, our awesome community, must step up to help. When reporting someone who you believe to be cheating or exploiting the game, we need you to record a brief video clip This can be done via smartphone, camcorder, or PlayStation Eye. Once you have the video, please send the message describing the incident in detail, plus a link to your video, and we will investigate the report. What's interesting about this is that there was a time, I guess, that Naughty Dog was actively looking into cheaters and banning them. Although, I have to be honest, I don't know that this was ever really done to a large degree. In fact, on the PS3, there was not only cheating through exploits, there was straight up hackers, and it was a mess whenever you ran into one of these hackers. So one of the very common ones that a lot of people ran into was the infinite smoke bomb, Molotov, and other throwable hack. And I've literally been on a match where someone was just throwing smoke bomb after smoke bomb after smoke bomb, and you were just left in this haze, and then they would just throw tons and tons of Molotovs, and usually they were so bad and they just missed you all over the place. But regardless, this was happening. There also was some sort of aimbot that was able to be done on the PS3 version. I remember even with a helmet on, I could get one-shotted with hunting rifles sometimes, and there's definitely situations where you could see that the player wasn't even looking at you and somehow was able to get a headshot within a matter of seconds. And then, of course, the leaderboards was also kind of broken with people who kind of, I guess, hacked the leaderboards to try to put themselves at the top. Although I think also there were some glitches going on with that, so some people ended up towards the top just because of this glitch. But it's also interesting here in that, I don't know, I'm guessing this is still not active at all, because obviously if you're playing factions today, we have wall shooting. But this just goes to show that the cheating on PS3 was pretty egregious whenever you did run into someone. And luckily with the PS4 version, there's no straight up hackers, but there are definitely people that are exploiting glitches in this game. Now, at the end of that month of October, there was something pretty special in the Last of Us factions community, and that was the Apocalypse tournament. Now, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Triple Rec, but he kind of got a start on Uncharted multiplayer and actually ended up getting pretty big on Destiny, but he also played some factions in the early days, and he put on this Apocalypse tournament that was supported by Naughty Dog and PlayStation. And this was kind of the first real competitive matchup that occurred on this game. And it certainly would end up spurning off additional competitive modes. There's, of course, the age-old FN or Fragged Nation rules, which are based on a competitive ladder that was set up to host factions competitive. But this Apocalypse tournament had some different rules. There was armor allowed in some of the modes, and the maps were pre-chosen. But this is a tournament that I think definitely needs to be recognized in the history of factions. And one reason for this is because of the winners of this tournament, Four Nations. And the notable thing about Four Nations is they had this one person on their team named Virens. And everyone was scared of this guy, Virens, because he was a sniper and he would take everyone's head off when they weren't expecting it. The game had been a little bit more slow and tactical, but with Virens around, you better watch yourself, because if you expose your head for even a split second, he could get you. And this may not be the first real instance of drag shooting with the hunting rifle, but this was kind of the first major displays and kind of more widespread showing off of this type of ability with this game. Virens would kind of go on to inspire a lot of people to take on the hunting rifle, because he really, I think, in a lot of ways revolutionized and highlighted that this gun actually was very strong. By doing the drag shot technique, he was taking off people's heads, and you can see he still has a YouTube channel where he has a highlights video for the Apocalypse tournament finals, and you can see him just taking everyone's head off and doing such an amazing display. So I think his contribution to factions and what we see a lot of today, which is that quick scoping sniping, really kind of is owed to Virens in a lot of respects. At least, again, for spreading the knowledge and understanding that this is actually something that can happen. Now, after October, there were other patches and updates that occurred. There were some exploits on maps that were patched out, like the suburb one, where you could climb on top of the generators and you would have a full view of the whole map, but Naughty Dog took a lot of focus to try to reduce lag and do a lot of matchmaking fixes. Obviously, they didn't fix everything because we still have problems with that even today, but they did put in a lot of work there. They did make a few other tweaks, like with patch 1.06, which came alongside the Left Behind DLC, February 13th, 2014. This patch reduced a speed bonus that players assisting with revives, because you could overexploit revives and pick someone up within a matter of seconds, so they reduced that a little bit. They also fixed this shiv dance, so people may know that you can still do the shiv dance. This is basically running around an opponent and shivving them. It's kind of a very fancy move, but in the past you could do that no matter what, whether a player damaged you or not. And so players were getting a lot of shiv dances pretty frequently. There was a lot of people who, once you understood how to do this, could do this. But Naughty Dog made it so that if you damage a player, that player won't be able to shiv you for the next 3 seconds. And so this did kind of eliminate a lot of the high frequency of shiv dances, and it also brought a lot more skill to it in that you had to actually avoid being damaged in order to pull it off. This also included Crafter 3. It was increased from 5 loadout points to 6 loadout points. The military sniper was decreased from 4 loadout points to 3 loadout points. The machete was decreased from 4 loadout points to 3. Strategist 1 was decreased from 2 to 1 loadout point, and the collector bonus no longer applied to gifting items or healings. You used to be able to put collector on and first aid training 3, and it would multiply the amount of parts you got like crazy. So this would be a really strong way to just get a lot of parts really fast. Now, before I get to the next patch, I do want to talk a little bit about something that I know was happening during this time. And there was a bit of a shift occurring, at least in the meta of this game. And it was kind of, apparently, as you'll see when we talk about this next patch, it was kind of happening under the radar. At least it seemed that this wasn't really happening to Naughty Dog's knowledge. But as I said in the past, the semi-auto had gotten a nerf and was slowly falling from the top spot as the strongest gun. And I also mentioned how Virons had elevated the hunting rifle up to a degree where it was a very viable gun to use. But there was also the burst rifle. And what was happening was, especially with the Reddit community, the Last of Us faction subreddit, which I would frequent all the time to just try to strategize and understand what people were discovering and just talk about the game. But within this Reddit community, there was a group of people, and I think there's some notable names people may recognize. Kivid, especially, this guy Billiken, If Batman Was Real, and there were some others, but a number of these players began using the burst rifle, and part of it was an anti-semi rifle sentiment. It was, hey, the semi's OP, so we're going to challenge ourselves a little bit more and use the burst rifle, which was considered weaker. But these players especially had kind of discovered a way to really become effective with this gun, especially this guy Kivid, who I ran into a lot, and I basically would just have my head exploded whenever I played against him. And basically what they had discovered was that if you lightly pull down on your right thumbstick as you're shooting, you could basically control the amount of recoil that the burst was giving and allow it to shoot much straighter. And if you were able to do this in combination with mastering the ability to get headshots, you could basically destroy someone. And at the time, this was considered much more of an acquired skill. Not a whole lot of people knew how to do this effectively, and it was something that was just kind of coming up. But because of the damage multiplier that the burst rifle had, and in combination with especially Sharpshooter 3, which would give 25 health back for every headshot that was gained, you could end up basically running around the map, and if you were good enough with your aim, you could basically become invincible because all you had to do was take your burst and make sure you were getting headshots. And so this was kind of happening within the Reddit community. But then patch 1.07 happened. And patch 1.07 actually included a lot of things that we'll talk about. This was actually the Reclaimed Territory map pack. But a couple things that are very notable is that there was a couple major buffs that were made to the burst rifle. The burst rifle would now destroy armor in only 2 bullets. I believe it was at first 3 bullets. And then the upgrades for the hunting rifle and the burst rifle now cost $300 for the first level and $600 for the second level. So now, in addition to the bursts buff that was received earlier, the reduction of ammo cost, in addition to the being able to destroy armor so quickly and having the upgrade costs reduced, this made the burst super, super powerful. And I remember at the time being so confused because people were dominating with the burst at this time, and then it had received all these buffs. And I really just think that this had kind of slid under Naughty Dog's radar. They were still hearing that people were frustrated and thought the burst was weak. Meanwhile, though, a group of Redditors had discovered the true potential and power of it. But by the time this patch came out, it was too late. And so this really pushed the burst into that overpowered territory. But there was also some notable balances and bug fixes that occurred that we should talk about. For one, this patch fixed a bug that allowed players to avoid being stunned by smoke by vaulting over cover. And this was definitely something that honestly I was using all the time. It was something that I kind of in a way considered a bit of a skill, but basically what happened is someone would throw a smoke bomb, and just as it was about to explode, if you did a vault over some cover, you would completely avoid being stunned. In essence, though, this kind of eliminated the smoke bomb in being effective at all if you knew how to use this. But especially for me, I was a little bit conflicted at the time because when you have a smoke bomb against Explosion Expert, you can't avoid it. And so having this to me felt like a good counter such that you wouldn't always get trapped by a smoke. But regardless, I understand why this fix was made. And this also fixed a bug that allowed players to exploit supply boxes for extra ammo and 2x4s. So that 2x4 exploit that I was talking about earlier, this kind of fixed that. It also made some big changes to the machete, which now interrupted melee just like gunshot wounds did. Part of the problem here was that people were complaining that the upgraded 2x4 would often win out in a fight against the machete. And because the machete was something that you had to purchase, it felt like the machete should have been stronger. So with this, it basically allowed the machete to stun any 2x4 swings, and it changed it to, rather than being a 2-swing weapon, it was a 2-swing weapon to down. It now became a 3-swing, but a little bit faster. This patch also upgraded melee weapons to now require 3 items. It used to only be a blade and a binding, but now you also had to include a rag. So this created a little bit more of a risk reward and a choice where you had to decide, am I going to make a Molotov or am I going to make a modded melee weapon? There also was buffs to the 9mm and the shorty, which now cost 250 parts for their first upgrade. Sharp Ears 3 now had a 3rd level and had all of the levels buffed. And then Downtown had its render settings altered a little bit to make players appear brighter on the level and to make the overall lighting on the level a bit brighter. And this is pretty funny because people still complain about how dark Downtown is, and just imagining how dark it used to be on the PS3 before they made this change, it's really funny. And although I honestly do like Downtown and I think the lighting is fine now, I think the bad reputation that it had in the past before this change was made ultimately just gave it a bad rap all the time. But this patch also added a lot of new things. So we also got new maps. This was DLC Map Pack 2. We got Water Tower, Capital, Coal Mine, and Wharf. And what this did was this actually created a 4th playlist for each mode, where you would now have parties, no parties, DLC 1 and DLC 2 to choose from. And this really split the PS3 player pool. And ultimately, it wasn't very fun because I, for instance, liked playing Bookstore, but I could only do that with DLC Map Pack 1. But now that DLC Map Pack 2 was out, the DLC Map Pack 1 playlist was a lot less populated. It was a little bit harder to find matches. And usually people, at least at the higher levels of play, were playing the DLC Map Pack 2. So what really happened that bothered me was I ultimately never really got to play any of DLC Map Pack 1 because that's just not where the players were. But this patch also included new weapons, one of which was free, which was the full auto rifle, which I remember people were so super scared for because it was basically like adding an automatic rifle into the game. People thought it was going to be turned into Call of Duty with the full auto rifle, but that didn't really happen. But then they added paid weapons and perks. And I remember at the time, I don't think this was super controversial just yet. I think on the PS3 days, this kind of thing was happening a lot more often. It wasn't such a taboo thing to have these paid perks and weapons, it really did become more of an issue when this was included in the PS4 version of the game, where I think that's where you heard a lot more vocal complaints about this. But this added 4 new guns: the Enforcer as a pistol, the double barrel, a 1-point shorty type gun, the Spectre, which was a 3-point silenced automatic weapon, and the Launcher, which was another one of those weapons that really scared people because they thought it was going to become invincible. And it is kind of funny, you can be really effective with the Launcher, but it definitely wasn't as bad as a lot of people were afraid of. This also added new survival skills: Executioner, which adds more parts for shiv kills, special executions, and also lets you craft additional shivs every time you craft one. It added Scavenger, which drops more ammo at the various levels. It added Damage Marker, which marks targets when they're receiving damage rather than having to manually mark them. It added Awareness, which keeps enemies' name tags on screen. It's almost like marking the enemy. It just lets you kind of see them a little bit more and be able to track them a little bit more. It added Fortitude, which allows you to have a little bit more health when downed and have a little bit longer bleed out time and faster crawling speed and the ability to hold an extra health kit. It also added Gunslinger, which gave you more pistol ammo. Bomb Expert, which was another heavily complained about perk, especially at level 3, where you're immune to the stun of your own smoke bombs. This, especially in combination with the smoke bomb fix that occurred in the bug fixes, especially made this quite a frustrating perk to be able to see brought into this game. And then, of course, Agility, which allowed for your movements to be a lot quicker. Of course, there was also new gestures, and something I haven't really been talking about much, but throughout this whole time, there also was customizable items that were added to the game to just give you a little bit more choice in how you look. And a lot of these customization items were, of course, paid, but it's a lot less taboo of a thing to have paid customization items. Of course, this last patch here was pretty major. It added a lot of new things. It changed a lot of the game, and it split the player pool. But it was certainly fun because I remember all of these new things that we got to explore and discover. It was a major patch on all accounts. And of course, there were things I didn't like that were added here, but there were certain things that I especially loved. And of course, looking at today, I kind of miss getting updates for Naughty Dog multiplayer. And so, yeah, when you compare the state of this game at this point in 2014 to the initial release, Naughty Dog had made a lot of significant changes that tremendously evolved this game. And a community had grown around this game. According to Aaron Daly in the PlayStation blog, Factions was very active on the PS3, and it was getting 9,000 concurrent players, which about a year out from initial release, to me, seems to be a pretty big number for a game that wasn't really intended to be anything too grand or special. But perhaps the biggest change for this game was right around the corner. The Last of Us had been remastered, and it was set for release on the PS4. The Factions multiplayer was also a part of that remastered package, and this would change the game forever. The Last of Us came out at an interesting time. 2013 was the last year of the PlayStation 3 generation. The PlayStation 4 was right around the corner and was released in November of 2013, and the system wasn't backwards compatible. So while The Last of Us was receiving endless praise and was arguably a system seller for the PS3, Sony was trying to get players to transition to their new hardware. So it makes sense that Naughty Dog would create a remastered version of the game to sell on the PS4. A superior version that showed off the power of this new hardware. Of course, this also brought along a superior version of The Last of Us Factions, 60 frames per second with all DLC maps included in every playlist, and some new features planned and bug fixes, of course. This ushered this multiplayer mode into a bit of a renaissance as the community continued to grow, as Factions was regularly being sold as a pack-in for the PS4, growing and growing the player base, and as support for the game under Naughty Dog continued. But how long would the fun last? July 29th, 2014 is when The Last of Us Remastered was released on the PlayStation 4. Naughty Dog Dog had made some pretty significant updates to factions up to this point. 8 maps were added, as well as payable guns and perks and customizable items. And about 1 week prior to release, they pushed a live update that made a few changes to factions on the PS3, which we would see incorporated into the PS4. There was a couple of balancing tweaks, such as agility level 3 being removed and agilities level 1 and 2 being rebalanced, as well as some other additional tweaks to the new perks that had been added. So these were already baked into the PS4 version, but there also would be a number of additional new things brought to that version that would actually come to the PS3 about a month later. For one, the hunting rifle scope was altered to show the headshot hit marker. So in the past, it had shown what looked like a body shot marker, but the horizontal and vertical lines of the scope blocked out those markers. So you couldn't really tell if it was a body shot or a headshot until you got that notification that you got a headshot and the additional parts. They also tweaked the hunting rifle scope at level 2 to look a little bit different. And also the hunting rifle now got a significant boost in damage. It was now doing 70 damage instead of 55. It would still be 2 body shots to down, but players were able to finish off wounded enemies more easily. And this introduced something that a lot of players hated, and that is the combo. Now what this was is using a hunting rifle, getting a body shot, and then switching really quickly to a revolver and downing them really quickly. And this was viewed as pretty cheap in many ways because a lot of people prided themselves on using the hunting rifle and getting headshots rather than body shots. But this made it almost just as viable, and it kind of encouraged players not to try to go for headshots because you had this much easier method to secure it down. That's why you might see a lot of players like me using the hunting rifle without a revolver, using it with a 9mm, so that in the event that I do get a body shot and I do want to finish them off with a 9mm, I can somehow feel a little bit better about myself. Additionally, there was a little bit of a reduction in aim assist on the second level zoom of the hunting rifle and the military, as well as a fix for being able to buy ammo for purchasable weapons on the waiting to respawn screen without the price going up. People were beginning to exploit this. You could basically buy purchasable while you were respawning for a much cheaper price than live in the game. There was also, some other bug fixes and an improved team balance, and all of this was ready and packaged together when The Last of Us Remastered finally did release. Now, one of the most significant upgrades that the remaster did was it made the game 60 frames per second, which was really a game changer for a lot of people. It just felt so much smoother. People felt like they were more accurate. It was very visually striking and appealing. And it's actually funny because this was at the beginning of the PS4 era that they had made this game 60 frames per second. And a lot of people, especially me, it kind of put an expectation in our heads that all PS4 games would come out at 60 frames. We'd come to find out later that even Naughty Dog's next game, Uncharted, the single player would come out at 30 frames per second, and a lot of games came out at 30 frames per second. So it's kind of funny that this is one of the pretty much few games that managed to get 60 frames on the PS4. The other good update that occurred with this release is it consolidated all the DLC into one playlist. So everyone who bought the remastered essentially received the DLC map packs for free. It's funny because this part doesn't really get mentioned in the more recent conversations about The Last of Us Part 1 remake and how that was $70. A lot of people say, yeah, sure, it includes the Left Behind DLC, but it doesn't include the multiplayer. And so maybe that makes it a little bit of equivalent. But the remaster did include the Left Behind DLC. It also did include the multiplayer, but not only that, it also included the DLC map packs, which were going for about $10, maybe even $15 a pop. So by getting the remastered version, you were getting some tremendous savings. On the other hand, though, this was about the time that PlayStation had begun requiring PlayStation Plus in order to play online. So on the PS3 version of the game, you didn't really need PlayStation Plus. You could just play online, no problem. But with the PS4, people had to get PlayStation Plus. And I can't remember, but those that were on the PS3, that may have been a requirement for them around this time as well. And so this game came out, and people that had the PS4 version of Factions were very happy. Those of us on PS3, however, kind of felt a little bit screwed because, by the way, I was on the PS3 version for almost a year, maybe 9 months before I actually got the PS4 and the PS4 version of this game. And if you were on the PS3, you basically saw the player base dwindling by the second as this PS4 version came out, because it wasn't crossplay and it was also the inferior version. So anyone that had secured a PS4 was often going for the remastered version to get that upgrade. And yeah, I was on the PS3 for quite a long time. The player base started dwindling. We were still able to find matches, but it was a little bit harder, especially the DLC 1 playlist, which had Bookstore, Bus Depot, Hometown, and Suburbs, was a little bit harder to find a match. And I mean, with all those different player pools, it was just not as good. And of course, like over time, as people peeled off, it just became laggier and laggier, and you ran into cheaters a little bit more often, and it wasn't as fun. But for those on the PlayStation 4 version, they were having a blast, and actually the community was really starting to grow. So of course the community grew pretty well during the PS3 days. I remember, for one, I would always go on the Last of Us faction subreddit, and there was always some really interesting topics, people getting into debates, people sharing skills and secrets, and it was awesome. And then, of course, you have your content creators from the PS3 era. Sancho West, of course, had the best tips and tricks tutorials, and I don't think I would know how to stealth in this game if it weren't for him, especially learning how to shiv. I got most of my skills directly from his videos. And then McKillers was another pretty notable one who analyzed people's gameplay. He kind of gave you a little bit more in-depth analysis of strategy and what players were doing. And then he also was very good at coming up with unique games and modes and challenges that people could play. There was I remember Protect the President, where 3 people teamed up would try to defend a completely random player for fun, as well as other like private fun matches. Like these types of things were happening on the PS3, but I do feel like on the PS4, the community really began to shine. Of course, there was content creators, Nick A30 is especially one that a lot of people have a lot of fond memories of, and he, had a lot of fun videos, tips, and also challenge videos as well. But I think one of the game changers here was that the PlayStation 4 allowed everyone to basically have a channel and post content, because the system had the ability to record and capture your gameplay. It also had the ability to go live on Twitch, and this really allowed everyone to kind of participate. For one, Sancho West was able to do his top 10 plays, and this was really sourcing captured footage from people that were able to play on the PS4 and capture their best moments. For me especially, I took a lot of time to watch the more try-hard players and really try to understand like how they played and what secrets they knew and kind of how they reacted to certain situations. I did that quite a bit in order to try to hone and perfect my own abilities with the game. And then of course, during this time, this is when we got to see a lot more community events. I'll talk a little bit more about some of those, but first I want to get to the next major patch which would release and how this would affect the game. So this was actually a live update to patch 1.02 on the PlayStation 4 version, and this added new weapons. This added the variable rifle, the scoped semi-auto, the scoped full auto, and the scoped burst rifle. Now, I do remember at this time, many people were more afraid of the scoped weapons than anything else, less so the variable rifle. But it actually turns out that the scoped weapons weren't really that great. I mean, to be fair, the scoped burst rifle can be fairly powerful, and the scoped semi isn't that bad either. But for the most part, these haven't really been used as super viable options, and the scoped full auto is more or less a joke of a gun. The variable rifle, however, was very strong. And of course, these were paid DLC weapons. Variable rifle, of course, it allowed you to scope in and out. The only other weapon that could do this was the El Diablo, or the hunting rifle at the second level / military sniper, which just allowed you to zoom from the scope in and out. But the variable rifle was really good. It was fast. It was pretty accurate. I mean, it had a lot of good qualities to it. It's a very strong weapon, and I would consider it a top tier weapon. I think at this point, the burst rifle still beats it out, but the variable is still a pretty strong alternative, especially on a little bit more longer range maps where the burst may not have the advantage. This live update also included some updated preset loadouts that incorporated some of these new weapons. But alongside this, a few days after these weapons came in, was the introduction of the last 2 maps, free maps in this case, that would be incorporated into all playlists. And this was Beach and Financial Plaza. That's really funny because these 2 were added and they're free, of course, but I remember at the time when this came out, because they were more fresh, Naughty Dog made it so that the playlist showed these maps a whole lot more often. And so it got to a point where, yeah, it made sense within like the first week or 2 to be seeing these maps showing up regularly. But after that point, those who were playing this game, I remember there was a time it was just like Beach or Financial Plaza like every other game, and I was getting so sick of these. They did eventually fix that, but I remember it got a little bit insane. Now with this, we had all the maps added and a good number of new guns, but there was also some community events going on that are notable. So the first one that I want to talk about is the Reddit records. So this was something going on in the Reddit community, and this is one of those things that really was only possible with the ability to capture and record footage. Although you could record from your phone on PS3, but it kind of was grainy and bad, and you had to record and delete a lot. So what this was basically though was, for each gun, you could try to get a record, and that was how many downs can you get with a single gun in one match. I will say that I got the bow Reddit record, and I was very proud of this. And if anyone that did get one of these records was given a golden weapon as their flare on the Reddit, and it was a really nice badge of honor. And it was a really fun event. You submitted your Reddit record entry and you got the thing, and people were kind of able to, get their name out there a little bit. And it was a fun challenge way to experience this game, a little bit of a meta game that, wasn't a part of the main game. Now, the other community I want to talk about that was rising at this time as well is the competitive community. And most specifically was the Frag Nation community. So Frag Nation, a lot of people may have heard this word, but maybe don't know the origins of it. They might know, FN rules or FN mode or whatever. Frag Nation was a website. It was a ladder website that allowed players of games to compete and establish a ranking for their team. Now, Frag Nation had been going on since the PS3 days, essentially right after the Apocalypse tournament concluded. Frag Nation was a thing. I think even before that as well, Frag Nation was going on. People were enjoying the competitive scene, but I think it really exploded during the PS4 era. Especially, I think, because people could capture their gameplay and perhaps brag a little bit. It became a way for try-hard players to basically gain a little bit of clout and reputation within the community for their skills and ability to beat other players. So, Frag Nation, the rules were a little bit more simple at the time. It was no armor, no Molotov, no purchasable weapons. That was basically it. And there was, at the time, a PS3 ladder and a PS4 ladder. I, of course, was playing pretty actively on the PS3 ladder at the time, but the PS4 ladder was very active. And it was so much fun to watch these competitive matches. Without armor involved in the equation, I feel like it becomes a little bit more tactical when you're playing. You really have to be kind of careful. You really have to be good with aiming. It really kind of honed your skills, and it was very exciting to watch. And play, of course. Now, there are, of course, some notable players in the competitive community. There's this player, Japo, who was a sniper, and he was kind of famous for never using sharpshooter when he played. And then, of course, there is Scrub Central. Scrub Central was perhaps the most winningest, is that a word? Winningest teams on Frag Nation. They usually won the latter seasons, and they were a really good team. One thing I think that they were particularly strong in is their teamwork. It was really hard to go up against them, especially because they were really good at backing each other up. Even if you were able to get one, the next guy was right around the corner, and they were really good with reviving and picking people up. It was a pretty unstoppable force within this scene. They even went on to win the Pumpkin Cup, which was a tournament that was happening on both PS3 and PS4 for those respective player bases, and it was supported by the Reddit and this user Blue Pumpkin. And I competed in this tournament. It was a lot of fun, and I especially miss really active and competitive tournaments. And so what was interesting about all this, the competitive scene, the Reddit records, any of the community events, was that even when the game itself was maybe starting to dwindle in support from Naughty Dog, the community was standing in and coming up with ways to keep the game fresh. The competitive scene, of course, continued to keep it fresh by showing the most elite gameplay and having very interesting matches, and then other community events along the way just help the community build. Of course, there are other things that happen in the community, and I'll talk about some of those, but these were kind of the ones that were happening in the early days of the PS4. But then there's patch 1.06, which came out, and this did something interesting and new. One, this added new DLC executions. So now, rather than just paying for guns, customizational items, and perks, these new special executions were brought to the game, which could be paid for DLC. And these were actually really cool. It just gave you a little bit of a interesting new visual flair as you were performing your special execution. I really love the 9mm one. For some reason, you just kind of pump a bunch of bullets into the person. But this added a lot of new freshness to the game. A lot of people really like these, and I think especially because these were not really game changing. But so these didn't add any gameplay changes, so it was more customization, so it wasn't really considered pay to win. I actually think Factions 2 probably will add DLC special executions as a way to monetize without affecting gameplay. But this patch also added new DLC weapons and DLC perks. It added the very infamous tactical shotgun. It added the burst pistol. In the patch notes, it's called the short rifle, but it's really the frontier rifle, and the crossbow. And then for survival skills, it added Lone Wolf, Second Chance, Jack of all trades, lucky break, and lethal efficiency. And then of course there's also some new DLC headgear as well as gestures. Now, while people did love the new DLC additions, this was perhaps one of the most contentious patches, especially because of the addition of the tactical shotgun. People did not like the shotguns in this game. The purchasable shotgun was very much hated. The shorty was also not popular, especially shorty dancing. It was something that drove people insane, me too. The tactical shotgun was adding a shotgun when shotguns were already super unpopular. And you kind of understand why they did it. It's, this game, Factions, has a pretty tough learning curve. And so I believe Naughty Dog was looking for ways to make it a little easier for newer players who were just getting into the game to get used to it and get into it. So they added the tactical shotgun, but the problem here was that it was something that experienced players were using to much effect as well. And a lot of people don't complain about the frontier rifle, but I actually think that's almost just as bad as the tactical shotgun. And I think one thing that these two weapons introduced or kind of changed in the Factions meta was the game kind of at this point became a two-shot to down type game. Most weapons at this point, or a large amount of the weapons at this point, were now two shots to down. You had the hunting rifle, tactical shotgun, frontier rifle, the bow, as well as, crossbow, El Diablo, and the shorty. And I might be missing some, but a lot of them. Basically, the idea was a lot of these very often used guns were now two shots to down. And it kind of changed the meta in that way, in that it kind of allowed for camping to be a little bit more effective than I think it used to be. Because you could kind of camp, and then as long as you got the jump on someone and got them with that first bullet, they were already lower than half health. And your chances of kind of coming back from that and surviving are pretty minimal. And so players really had to try to do a lot of things to adapt to facing off against a larger amount of these two-shot weapons. This is kind of where I believe pop shooting became a little bit more of an effective thing and a lot more of something that players needed to do in order to survive. That's where you're kind of standing behind cover and just popping in and out and shooting while you're popping in and out. You can do this with the semi-auto rifle as well and the burst, but this just kind of made it hard for players, even with great reaction time, to win out in these two-shot scenarios. It's definitely something that I noticed. It's definitely something that I think a lot of people noticed, and it definitely changed the game from what it kind of was before. Another thing that became pretty apparent after the release of this patch was players were not very happy. I remember there was a lot of complaints that now this game had become pay to win. And that argument had been made earlier because ever since the release of patch 1.07 on the PS3, Naughty Dog had released paid guns and perks. But at this point, especially with the tactical shotgun, I think people were starting to get really pissed off. And also this was the PS4, and by this point there had been enough backlash for things that were considered pay to win, or even things that were altering the game. A lot of people who had played since the early PS3 days didn't have as big of an issue with these payable guns and perks, especially because a lot of people had known that the strongest guns and perks were all the free ones that were available with the game. But this did offer enough player variety that you could make arguments that especially things like the variable rifle and the tactical shotgun were pay to win in some respects. And so this ultimately gave a little bit of a negative strain towards this game. There were a lot of people that just had negative feelings about this game. This was also in addition to something that had been complained about during the PS3 days, and that is that the Platinum Multiplayer Trophy required a ton of playtime on factions. And it was good in a way that it introduced people to factions that probably never would have even considered it. And I think it did convert a lot of lifelong fans. But at the same time, having that serious of requirements was a little bit too much. And both of these things ended up being negative narratives that were associated with this game. But this patch also included a few balancing changes that are pretty important. For one, the silenced 9mm was now reduced to only one loadout point as a way to give the 9mm a little bit of an extra advantage. While I do think the 9mm is pretty viable, it wasn't, the strongest gun. The full auto rifle was then also given a silencer option. I totally forgot that it at some point didn't have a silencer. And then it also got its upgrade costs from 400 and 800 to 300 and 600 for each upgrade. The machete also was only 2 loadout points instead of 3, as well as getting an additional durability when it's modded. And then pretty important was some updates made to the spawning logic. And one thing that was for sure in the past was, especially on interrogation, was if you knew where players were spawning, you could spawn camp them pretty hard. It's still possible, but it's a little bit harder than it used to be. You used to know exactly where they were, and it was pretty egregious. There was this YouTuber, New You Extreme, who would often basically display how bad the spawning logic was, and he would play on interrogation and basically just sit in one spot where you could view people coming in, and as soon as they popped in, he would just destroy them. It was very unfair to players who really were just spawning in and already in complete danger, especially to well-coordinated teams that were abusing this. There also was some addition of new cover that was added to, I think, reduce a lot of the sight lines that maybe were perhaps a little bit too strong. University, for instance, there's this cover box added in one of the middle supply boxes in the classroom hallway that wasn't there before, and that was because there was a very popular spot you could get to where you could just snipe people's heads from the flower box. You could just snipe them immediately at that box, and you can still do that, but it's a little bit harder. These things were added to try to keep it a little more balanced and give players a little bit more of, especially newer players that wouldn't really know about these sniper spots, a little bit more of a chance. And now this patch actually came on December 9th of 2014, and pretty shortly thereafter there was already a live update making some fixes. There was a little bit of a slight nerf to the tactical shotgun and the frontier rifle already. This was on 12/24/2014, so a few weeks after this patch released, because what players were doing is they were firing and then quickly switching to another item and back to their weapon and then firing again. This was a way to kind of reduce the rate of fire. Usually there's a little bit of an animation that occurs in between shots that you could kind of get rid of when switching back and forth. Now, what's interesting here is that while Naughty Dog did nerf this for the tactical shotgun and Frontier, they didn't completely remove this exploit. They left a little bit of a rate of fire increase that you could take advantage of by using this tactic. And that's because Naughty Dog did recognize that players can employ some of these tactics as a bit of a skill. So this is where things get a little bit of a gray area. Of course, something like wall shooting is not something that Naughty Dog would recommend, although they haven't patched it or really spoken on it, but I think it's a safe assumption they wouldn't want that to be something in the game. But this is something where it provides a little bit of a benefit, but not such a game-breaking one. And because it takes a little bit of a finessing with the controller, they wanted to leave a little bit of room for skilled players to take advantage of some of these things. I believe they referred back to games that had some popular little things that you could take advantage of that allowed for some small advantages. And I think that's important, honestly, that some of that remains, that there is a little bit of that. Of course, you have to judge it, by how game breaking it might be, but certain little small advantages that kind of reward players that have developed a little bit of skill, I think should be allowed. Just not crazy things like wall shooting. Now, at this point, patches and updates were starting to kind of slow down, but there was still one that was fairly significant that occurred on 3/31 in 2015. And what this did was this gave a slight buff to the Frontier rifle by decreasing its upgrade costs from 400 and 800 to 300 and 600, as well as increasing their accuracy. Two things I don't think it was really needed, but I don't think enough people recognize how strong the Frontier rifle can be. Now, something that the community had been asking for forever finally happened, which was a nerf to the purchasable shotgun. So, players were really complaining for a long time, justifiably so. It is still, a very, even to this day, kind of an overpowered purchasable. And it's funny because people call it the 4-pointer, but it actually used to be 3 points. And so this changed the purchasable shotgun from 3 points to 4 points, as well as increasing the cost of ammo. The launcher was given a slight buff. It moved from 4 points to 3 points, as well as having its ammo cost decreased. And then some of the other guns, the military sniper, assault rifle, Spectre, and flamethrower also had their ammo costs decreased. And something that I have been able to benefit from quite a bit is the survival skill Second Chance had its loadout point cost reduced from 2 and 3 points to 1 and 2 points. So now I'm able to put that 1 point Second Chance perk on most of my loadouts as I do today. And then another thing I want to mention that I wasn't able to really source exactly which patch this occurred in, but the bow was also given a slight nerf. It had this ability to corner shoot with it, where only your hand was exposed if you did this. And it allowed the bow a little bit of an advantage, one there where, of course, the bow is not one of the strongest guns in the game. It's quite a difficult gun to use, but Naughty Dog ultimately, I guess, decided that this was too strong of an advantage to have, and so made it so that your body did poke out now when you were corner shooting with the bow. And it's really funny to me because over the years with all of these patches and giving buffs to all these guns like the burst and the hunting rifle, frontier rifle, all these guns getting buffs. And then you have the bow here, which wasn't very strong. It was a very hard gun to use. Of course, there are people that do pretty well with it, but it was never super overpowered and definitely could have used a little bit of a buff. Now, I remember one of the excuses going around, I think this came from Naughty Dog, is that in the right hands, the bow could be super powerful. And while I definitely think that, yeah, there are some great bow players out there, I don't think that a buff to, say, the loadout point cost or the upgrade cost would have tipped the needle any further. And it certainly, I think, even in the right hands, doesn't make it stronger than someone that has a burst rifle and can one burst you. But this last patch that happened in March was perhaps one of the last significant patches that occurred. Something that Naughty Dog didn't actively tell us, but there weren't really any plans to do a whole lot of major updates from this point. And so we wouldn't really see them for a while. And so a lot of the responsibility for keeping this game afloat turned back to the community. And I mentioned earlier that there were community events that occurred, and at this point there was something called the clan battles. And this was, again, the Reddit community organized this, and this is where players with kind of like-minded either play styles or they came from kind of the same area joined together to create clans. And there were certain clans like the Purple Cobras and those Dirty Bastards and the Fireflies, San Frontieres, and there were others. But these clans kind of helped people build community and build a group with which they could play with. I don't think the battles really lasted too long, but it was something that helped keep this game afloat. It was almost like creating more factions within the factions community, but friendly competition. It was a little more friendly than FN, which was kind of more serious. Players took that really serious. And by the way, the FN community was still going very strong. This was actually around the time that I got my hands on the PlayStation 4. And I remember booting up the game and it was amazing. One thing that I did have issues with was I was getting a lot of input lag, which I didn't really understand at the time. You know, CRT TVs, which a lot of PlayStation 3s played off of, had a much smaller input lag. And so I felt like my character was doing exactly what I wanted him to. But with the PS4, I was playing on a TV that wasn't really tuned for gaming. And so I was just kind of frustrated. I felt much worse. But regardless, I still, became active in a lot of the competitive scene, especially because I had started on the PS3. So I joined Frag Nation and it was very active. You could find a match in no time flat, and this was something that was pretty important for keeping the community alive, especially as Naughty Dog stopped really supporting. Another thing that kind of helped keep the player base alive was that a lot of PlayStations were being sold with The Last of Us Remastered bundled in. That's exactly how I got my copy of The Last of Us Remastered. It was a bundled deal, I believe, with a PS Plus as well. And so because of this, a ton of people ended up having the game and definitely helped keep the player base afloat, even without Naughty Dog actively providing additional support for it. Of course, though, without that active support and as the community kind of ebbed and flowed, players such as myself would kind of deviate off to other games. I remember I took a big time off playing Destiny. I was playing The Division, even Metal Gear Online. I was kind of hoping to find, honestly, a multiplayer that would kind of replace my love for factions. Nothing ever truly did, of course, but these were some nice little distractions that kept me away from factions long enough to pine for it again and come back. And as I said, Naughty Dog wasn't really actively supporting it. There was a few exploits. There was like this big coal mine exploit that was going around where players could get behind the rocks and they'd be able to see through the entire map. So there were some pretty bad exploits going on. So Naughty Dog did patch this. What's interesting though is at this time, some of the more egregious exploits, they weren't really discovered yet. At least they weren't discovered in such a public way. It's hard to tell. I don't know if people knew about wall shooting and crab walking, and I'll get to those later, but these were seemingly exploits that could have been done from day one. I think it just took a while for people to discover that these were exploits. So Naughty Dog, of course, their multiplayer team was actually working on their next multiplayer. They were working on Uncharted 4 multiplayer, and there was a nice little beta that came out that again offered another nice distraction for us factions players. And it was a lot of fun. And one thing that I noticed, and I think a lot of people noticed, was that it did try to incorporate certain things from factions, things that the original Uncharted multiplayers didn't have, like the revive system and a pretty extensive kind of loadout system as well. And so eventually time came when Uncharted 4 came out. This was May 10th, 2016. And I think that this did end up serving a pretty substantial body blow to factions. I think because of the similarities, because it was a Naughty Dog game, because some factions players were Uncharted fans as well, I think a lot of people ended up jumping ship, at least for a while, from factions. I know I did. I know that a lot of people that I was playing factions with did. And I remember even the Uncharted multiplayer subreddit was populated with a lot of players that I knew from the factions subreddit. So I think this really did, kind of give a big player base body blow to factions. Of course, it's still trucked on, it's still carried on. And one thing I think that really, of course, for me, honestly, after my enjoyment of Uncharted multiplayer dissipated, I ended up taking a pretty big break from playing video games entirely. I would still log in every once in a while, play a factions match or an Uncharted match, but I was kind of, on a bit of a break at the time. But one thing that certainly generated a lot of hype within the factions community was in 2016, by the end of the year, when Naughty Dog announced The Last of Us Part 2 was coming. Because a lot of us factions fans had assumed, of course, that meant factions was going to get a sequel as well. And that ultimately did offer a lot of hope for us. We had loved our experience with factions, and, it was a little bit sad seeing Naughty Dog not really actively supporting it, but knowing and understanding that, yes, they were going to be working on another multiplayer. We were going to be getting a proper sequel, something that, I think a lot of us, can imagine what was going to be providing a lot of the things that, we had hoped for. Things like an infected horde mode, things like a co-op, maybe a little bit more robust stats and private match options. All these things that we had always hoped for, but just never received with factions we believed we would get here. But of course, the wait for The Last of Us Part 2 was a pretty long wait. During this time, though, the factions community still persisted. I know one thing that was pretty big in the community at the time was comebacks. Those videos were still doing very well on YouTube. I think a lot of people were really kind of getting into that for entertainment. This is also kind of the emergence of Tlu Strategist and Rage's Rager, both big factions YouTube creators. One thing I know that Tlu Strategist did that I think was very helpful for keeping the community together was these monthly challenge videos. I think one was called Bow July or something like that. And this was just something to kind of keep the game fresh, give players something to kind of challenge themselves with, for a month as they played. The competitive scene also kind of morphed at this time because Frag Nation, the website, actually shut down. So a lot of the competitive scene, I believe, moved over to Esports Hub, eShub. And so the competitive scene still carried on. I should also mention that there were a couple small patches that did have some impact on factions. There was the PS4 Pro came out, and so there were a little bit of enhancements that did apply to factions for any PS4 Pro users. Basically, the main one that I saw was a toggle that allowed you to either prioritize and even super sample and kind of make your resolution a little bit more enhanced. And there was one that would target frame rates as well. So players did get that little additional option when playing. And then there was, I guess, an attempt to patch out this glitch that had been in the game pretty much since the beginning. It was called ground aim, and it was when you would aim your gun and it would actually pull your aim all the way down to the ground. It always happened in the worst scenario. And so one of the patches does claim to fix this, but it really didn't, because this still happens all the time. Perhaps the frequency of it was reduced with this patch though. And so this kind of takes us through 2017. The community is small, but of course, that hardcore base is still there, but things we're about to start taking some pretty bad turns in the wrong direction. Of course, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when this started. Of course, I mentioned the exploits earlier, but from what I could see, it seemed like 2017 was when the crab walking exploit began. And this is an exploit where you basically had unlimited sprinting and unlimited listen mode, and you could kind of traverse around the map really quickly. You looked obviously really weird, kind of like a crab doing it. That's why people called it the crab walk. It was, kind of a way to spawn camp people and it was kind of one of those exploits that just gave people a little bit of advantage. Of course, this is one of the more controversial type exploits that are out there because I think there are basically two camps. Some people really think that it's okay to use because it does take, some controller skill to pull it off, and it doesn't completely break the game. I mean, every time I've run into crab walkers, I've been able to kind of pick them off just as easily as anyone else. But you also have a group of people that are really against this as well because, it is an exploit. And although Naughty Dog did kind of say that they are okay with certain types of exploits, I do think that this is probably one that goes above and beyond what they would consider acceptable. And so this exploit definitely has some people that are pretty passionate on either side. But of course, there's also the perhaps more infamous exploit that did pop its ugly head out around this time, around this period, and that is, of course, the wall shooting. And I don't know exactly when the earliest instance of the wall shooting began. I found a video from 2019 that kind of was showing it off, but of course, this was one of the worst things that could happen to this game, especially for a lot of us. We assumed Factions 2 was coming with The Last of Us Part 2, but Naughty Dog was pretty quiet about The Last of Us Part 2 for a long time, and so it was getting really hard to wait. And then you had this wall shooting happening, and Naughty Dog wasn't patching this game. They didn't really address these things. I don't even know if they probably didn't know about it for a while either, but it's just one of those things where, you had hope and then it started kind of waning. This also was the year 2019 when Naughty Dog decided to shut down the PS3 servers for Factions. They also shut down all the Uncharted multiplayer servers as well, but of course this was kind of a sad and scary day, I think, as it was just another marker that they're not interested in supporting these games anymore. I think it was definitely sadder for Uncharted fans than The Last of Us fans because a lot of people by this point had their PS4s and were able to play Factions, but definitely was, kind of a doom and gloom time. And this happened in September of 2019. And then this is when things really got low. And that was on The Last of Us Day 2019 when we found out that The Last of Us Part 2 would not have Factions in it. Initially, it was reported that The Last of Us Part 2 would not contain any multiplayer, even after confirmation that it would just a year prior. And this news shook the community. And there was an uproar, especially on Twitter and Reddit, where Factions fans were sent to a very dark place. Things were feeling pretty crazy and pretty sad for a moment there. But Naughty Dog, hearing all this commotion and probably surprised that enough people cared, decided to put out a statement clarifying that they were still planning to put out a multiplayer experience, but that it would be a separate experience from The Last of Us Part 2. Now, while most fans probably would have just been content with another tacked-on mode, the prospects of a fully realized ambitious sequel which could rise to the full potential that this game had, expand upon the gameplay and modes to include co-op, a horde mode, even a battle royale mode, taking the formula of Factions and doing something like The Division had with Dark Zone and things like that. It was all an exciting prospect. And so this put a lot of Factions fans at ease for the time. But the next few years would be pretty hard for those Factions fans, because after that statement came out in 2019, Naughty Dog didn't say anything for years. The Last of Us Part 2 ultimately came out, and no multiplayer came with it as expected, but fans weren't really sure how far behind the multiplayer experience would be. Occasionally, Naughty Dog would drop some vague hints, and you could read a little bit between the lines with their job postings, but fans of Factions were left frothing at their mouth for any information they could get. This is about the time that I started my channel. I was obsessed with finding out more about this game, and I was getting back into Factions again, trying to get good again and prepare for the sequel. I wanted to create a forum to discuss all the theories and discoveries for what this game would become, and that's what we did on this channel for a while. Now, it wasn't until 2022 that we would actually get some information. At Summer Games Fest 2022, Neil Druckmann took the stage with Jeff Keighley, and he showed off a concept art for the multiplayer game, which showed off what looked like a playable area huge in scope, and all signs pointed to this having a battle royale. While this was just a tease, Neil promised that we would learn a lot more about this game in 2023. And boy, was he right, but not for the reasons any of us had hoped. 2023 started off great. Naughty Dog released a small update at the beginning of the year for Factions 2. They included another concept art and teased yet again that we would still be getting more information later in the year. There was a large emphasis on the level of ambition for this title, and it was getting people very excited. The promise of more news and the release of The Last of Us TV show on HBO brought the original Factions back into a bit of a renaissance. Lobbies for Factions were packed. New players who had never experienced Factions before were getting involved. Interest in this game was at a new peak, and all of this was happening on the 10-year anniversary of The Last of Us. This felt like the year of The Last of Us. But soon the rug would get pulled from under all of us. With the PlayStation Showcase on the way, players expected finally that big Factions 2 reveal. But oddly, when it came out, it wasn't there, although a lot of other multiplayer games were shown. This was very strange and very weird. And we very quickly found out why this happened. Through reporting from Jason Schreier, Bungie, the famed Halo studio, which had been recently purchased by Sony, in part for their live service expertise, had been going around assessing the live service prospects of Sony's slate of upcoming multiplayers. They had about 12 in the pipeline at the time. Now, Factions was one of these, and apparently it was determined to be lacking the live service chops. And so it would be delayed. This was confirmed by Naughty Dog in a short statement, and this honestly put the Factions community into the worst limbo possible. Naughty Dog assured fans that they were still working on Factions, but at the same time, this setback felt like it would never come out, and like it was in some sort of development hell. It was so confusing. It's been years and didn't make sense why the game wasn't out. And it seems that there was some expectations for this game from Sony to deliver an experience at the level of a Fortnite or Call of Duty, or a game that would last forever and follow Bungie's live service concept of speed and delivery over quality. Understandably, a lot of these concepts seem to go against what Naughty Dog is known for: quality, the details, ambition, taking their time for perfection. And perhaps the ambition here was much too high, and their culture of perfection would make them too slow for what live service seemed to demand. In many ways, it was forcing Factions 2 to follow this entirely new type of path that Naughty Dog wasn't really used to. And it might mean completely changing the studio and trying to force a round peg into a square hole. And this seems to have been Naughty Dog's ultimate calculation, because at the end of 2023, after leaving their Factions fans completely in the dark for months, they finally confirmed the worst. Factions 2 was canceled. This was devastating news, and it was so confusing. It felt like a cop-out. How did Naughty Dog not know what this game required in terms of live service? How could they go from just earlier in the year saying that we would get more news to totally canceling it? Did they get cold feet? And couldn't they just release what they had already made as a box product experience? Could they hand over the reins to someone else? It didn't make sense, and I think we don't really have the full story. What they told us is definitely not the full truth. Maybe partially, but there's definitely some missing details here. The decision was made though. Factions 2 was canceled, and it felt like a slap in the face to their multiplayer fans. Naughty Dog has always been a primarily single-player studio, but they do have a history of having fun multiplayer experiences that are still quality. And they do have a history of rising to any occasion and not giving up. But here, they decided it wasn't worth it. And it also seemed like they decided that it wasn't worth keeping those multiplayer fans. It was devastating to the community who had waited so patiently. And now, as some sort of consolation, Naughty Dog released The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered with a brand new mode, No Return, which was a roguelike, kind of trying to be a fun way to replay the game a bit. But it was nowhere close to what multiplayer fans were looking for. It didn't even have a co-op. Players wanted to experience the world of The Last of Us together. But because of this mix of overambition, greed, and the challenging changes to the gaming landscape, Factions 2 had to fall. Now, to make matters worse, actual hacking has started to infect parts of the original Factions multiplayer in 2024. There already were the wall shooters, but now real hackers are there too. I haven't seen them yet, but I have seen the posts. It seems that the servers for this game will eventually close down. We don't know how long, but it doesn't seem like it will be around for much longer. Right now is the darkest time ever to be a Factions fan. But here's the amazing thing. Despite all the bad, despite the hacking, despite the promised sequel getting canceled, players are still here because there actually is something that special about this game. This game has been underestimated many times, but the community persists because there's a core foundation for an amazing multiplayer here. This game doesn't need updates. It doesn't need fancy progression. It doesn't need new skins, new content, and monthly drops to keep their players happy. The core gameplay is strong enough to keep these players around, and the passion and the dedication from the community has kept this game alive. When lost in the darkness, Factions fans have found some light. And perhaps one day Sony or Naughty Dog will recognize what they actually have here. We can see Sony still going forward with some of their multiplayer ambitions, and it seems they have turned their back on one of their multiplayers that had the most potential, but perhaps one day they will see the mistake they've made. Perhaps The Last of Us Part 3 can fulfill the promise with a multiplayer mode tacked on. But I think at this point, no matter what, nothing is ever going to replace what this game is, what the original Factions is. This game has meant so much to me and so many others. Factions is a masterpiece, and it is the greatest multiplayer of all time. And for that, I give it the highest S ranking on my ultimate video game tier list. Thank you for watching, and thank you to my YouTube members who've joined me on this journey and helping make my dreams come true. Consider becoming a super pooper trooper if you want to get these videos early. But otherwise, so long, pooper troopers.